to soak in that beautiful piece by Darin Sisoev and the Russian State Symphony Orchestra of Cinematography. I was searching around for a piece to try to capture a little bit of the mood as we journey together toward Holy Week, as we approach Palm Sunday, and that piece really spoke to me as having a kind of a mood of melancholy and of inevitability as Jesus sets his face toward his final confrontation with the powers. And indeed, tonight and tomorrow, as we commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Second Gulf War, many of us had that same sense of inevitability as that war approached, and we all sensed it was going to happen, and yet we continued to organize against it. And may we find the courage to struggle, keep struggling, and keep witnessing even when history seems to be against us. We're really delighted that you are part of our webinar tonight. With me here in the BCM World Headquarters here in Oakview is Charlita Erb and Tim Nafziger, who are journeying with us this year and working the magic, and Charlita's doing a lot of the chatting back and forth with you. If this is your first time, and there seems to be maybe 10 or so of you, from what we could tell from the list, who we don't recognize, if you haven't already chatted to Charlita, just to tell her where you're beaming in from and how you found out about it, that just helps us to know how you got wind of our BCM webinars. We're really delighted that you joined us. Please note that on the right hand of your screen is the chat function, and you can chat away. We don't try to encourage a lot of crosstalk during the webinar, but if there are questions or comments, there are going to be a number of times that we're going to stop during the webinar and ask for your input. We encourage you to use that chat function. It seemed to be about 30 plus people on the webinar tonight from at least 2 countries, Canada and the US. And again, we're so thankful that you joined us. If you have any problems, you'll notice in the chat box that Charlita's got her phone there, and you can call her and we'll try to get it sorted out for you. So we're going to go ahead and start. Now, many of you who have joined us before know that one of our vocations here at BCM, particularly in our studies of Scripture, is to try to replace these stories in a real world, to desentimentalize particularly stories that are beloved and traditional and yet have been sugar-coated, or as we say in the Easter season, chocolate-coated by a domesticated church. And to try to recover these stories as stories that took place and were narrated in very real-world landscapes. And we do this in order to try to understand ever more deeply the politics of Jesus, so that we, in our own following, in our day and age, can be more faithful. So one of the best ways to do that is to begin in our own real world, particularly the historical landscape of war and oppression and marginalization. So as noted, tonight and tomorrow we are commemorating, you've possibly heard this on the news, the beginning of the Second Gulf War in Iraq. There's so many people, both those in and out of government, who supported or at least did not oppose that war and who are now publicly regretting that debacle. Statistics don't have the power to move hearts and minds, but 2 will suffice that you probably know well. The Iraq Body Count website estimates that there were about 120,000 civilian deaths over the course of this war, more than 50,000 combatant deaths, um, and of course all kinds of destruction and trauma. But one of the interesting and troubling statistics is that veterans, particularly younger veterans of both Iraq and Afghanistan, those who have served in the War on Terror, have the highest suicide rate of all vets, between 2 and 4 times higher the average that we find in the civilian population. And for every suicide death of a vet recorded in 2009, at least 5 members of the armed forces were hospitalized for attempted suicide. On average, 18 veterans every single day in the United States take their own lives. These kinds of statistics remind us that this isn't just past history, this is present trauma that we all carry in our bones. And of course, this isn't counting the huge environmental cost that both Gulf Wars exacted through oil fires and the destruction of sensitive desert and marshlands habitats. So I just want to take a minute by way of further invocation to invite us to journey a little bit retrospectively. This is a quote from Greg Barrett's recently released book on the Gospel of Ruth War, Peace, and the Good Samaritan story in Iraq, the story of folks from the U.S. peace movement who were in Iraq before, during, and after the initial shock and awe campaign. And it's a rather poignant quote from the inimitable Wolf Blitzer of CNN, who was really reduced to silence as he watched the initial bombing campaign on this day 10 years ago. And after you've had a chance to look at that quote on the screen, I want to invite you, as part of our preparation for looking at Jesus' march on Jerusalem 2 millennia ago, to just take a moment and try to recollect where you were and what you were doing on the evening of March 19th and the morning of March 20th, 2003. The moment that the images of the shock and awe campaign began beaming back from Iraq and Bush announced the beginning of that campaign. And I just want to invite you to locate yourself in time and space, and even more importantly, to locate yourself in your emotional body. I know that Elaine and I were in Memphis, Tennessee. We were guest professors at Memphis Theological Seminary in the spring of 2003, and we were away from home. We were away from our native community. We were in the deep South, which is a very hard place to be during a time of war. It's a very, very difficult time for us as we immediately began trying to organize both in the seminary and in the city around this war. And I want to invite you to do the same, and if you want to use the chat function to share a little bit about where you were, what you were feeling, I think that will serve to get us in the psychic space that is appropriate for our topic tonight. So as we do that, I want to just one more time invite us to listen to a few bars from the opening music. And it will just take a couple of minutes and invite you to reflect. Beloved, thank you for those responses. You know, as we look at this image of bombs raining down over Baghdad, it is important that we in the heart of empire remember that those bombs were going off in our own souls as well. And many of you attest to the sense of isolation and frustration and powerlessness that you felt when shock and awe began. And it is my prayer that we can continue to knit back together the sense of community and human solidarity with one another here and with sisters and brothers in war zones abroad that is shattered by the cruel realities of war. This gospel that we approach tonight, although it starts off with a pretty lively, even noisy political demonstration in the Palm Sunday parade, ends up in the tone of lament. And it is good therapy still today for us to remember and to try to understand not only what happened in Iraq, but what happened to us as the result of these wars. So please continue to share in the chat function as you feel led. Thank you. Thanks particularly to Weldon, who's online and who got into Iraq shortly after the beginning of the campaign and was part of the Christian Peace Witness in Iraq during the war. Well, that brings us to our subject tonight, revisioning Palm Sunday, Jesus' march on Jerusalem in political and economic context. This image is one of my favorite posters. If Tim and Charlita look up to their left and right respectively, they see that poster. It sits in our office here at BCM from where we broadcast these webinars. It's a painting by Belgian artist James Ensor entitled The Entry of Christ into Brussels in 1889. Note carefully that it's painted in 1888. In this composition, a vast carnival mob in grotesque masks advances toward the viewer, a sea of frauds and clowns and caricatures of public, historical, and allegorical figures, including Belgian politicians and members of the artist's own family. Nearly lost amidst the throng is Jesus. Although he's compositionally in the middle of the painting, you barely see him. The haloed Christ on his donkey, which is in part of self-portrait by James Ensor. He's mostly ignored, he's precarious, he's an isolated visionary amidst the herd-like masses of modern society. It's interesting that Ensor, Belgian artist, was an atheist, but he identified with Christ as a spokesman for the oppressed and a humble leader of true religion. Interestingly, this controversial piece, which today is his most famous painting, was rejected by Le 20, the artists' association that James Ensor had helped to found. And it wasn't exhibited publicly until 40 years later, toward the end of his life. That's how controversial it was. Meantime, Ensor displayed the painting prominently in his home and studio. It is now at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and it's considered a forerunner of 20th century expressionism. I like this work because it captures the dynamism of a march, a political march, which is going to be our focus tonight. So does this recent representation of Ensor's work by Joel Pelletier's American Fundamentalists, Christ's Entry into Washington in 2008. This artist actually is a musician by trade, but so pissed off by the Christian right that in 2004 he did this searing critique of the political influence of American Christian dominionism. Note Bush and Cheney in the upper right-hand corner with Baghdad burning behind them. Banners on the left praising John Winthrop, John Nelson Darby, one of the authors of modern fundamentalism, Calvin, and Francis Schaeffer and Rush Limbaugh, all paraded. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see Osama bin Laden and other notorious terrorists watching from the windows. I start with these images because it seems to me that if we're going to rescue Palm Sunday from Disneyland, we're going to need some context. We're in year C in the Revised Common Lectionary, so we're going to be looking at Luke's version of Palm Sunday. Bit of a misnomer because it's not Sunday, and the third evangelist actually omits the mention of palms. We're going to pick this story up at Luke 19, but a few quick notes about the narrative context. And I really urge you, if you're able, to have a Bible in front of you for this webinar. We try to run these webinars in order to offer a monthly Bible study for folk out there. And it's always helpful to have the text. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem culminates the main plot of the second half of Luke, which is Jesus' journey from the north in Galilee steadily south to Jerusalem for a final showdown with the powers, from the margins of Palestinian society to its center. This plot point was introduced by Luke way back at the end of chapter 9, so it's for 10 chapters this plot has been developing. The end of this journey, of course, is the cross on the Hill of Skulls. During Holy Week next week, we Christians will typically reflect on Jesus' Via Crucis, the way of the cross. The problem with this is, unfortunately, it focuses our attention on the death of Jesus and inevitably on our theologies of the atonement, which become dysfunctional if we do not understand the life of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus. Because without understanding those, we can't understand why Jesus died. So I want to try to understand the narrative context of Luke as what I like to call the way, not of the cross, but the way to the cross, the way that Jesus lived in order to explain why he was killed. Now in Luke 18 and 19, we have the closing sequence of the Gospel's narrative of Jesus' public ministry. After the sequence, Luke ends his Gospel with three major sections: the Jerusalem conflict cycle, the Passion narrative, and then the Easter story in Luke 24. Now, the sequence of Luke 18 and 19 neatly articulates the building drama concerning Jesus' fate at the hands of the Jerusalem authorities on one hand, and his powerful practices of what we call Sabbath economics on the other hand. The latter is demonstrated here by his raising up of the lowly blind beggar on the outskirts of Jericho, and his bringing down of Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, in Jericho. This twinned healing represents the restoration of the body politic of Israel that had been shattered by socioeconomic disparity and injustice. This sequence thus succinctly captures the essence of Jesus' way to the cross. That is, it demonstrates in both deed and word the economic and political character of Jesus' ministry, which was perceived as sufficiently subversive by the local and imperial authorities of occupied Palestine that they felt compelled to execute the prophet from Nazareth. So let's look for a moment at the second two episodes of the four listed here, which actually mirror each other rather darkly, and which together represent the yin and yang of Jesus' ministry. The Zacchaeus story culminates Luke's series of tales in which Jesus challenges the rich and powerful to repentance, which for them very specifically means to execute concrete justice. Now, as many of you know, this was precisely the theme of our recently completed Bartimaeus Institute and the subject of a book I'm working on this year. Zacchaeus represents the discipleship of one rich man in Luke's story, resulting in radical wealth redistribution. And you can see this series of rather negative portraits of the 1%, as we would say today, in Luke's Gospel. The next story in the sequence is the infamous parable of the pounds, which tells a story about one manager who non-cooperates with the rich man's system and who ends up paying a heavy price. This parable is, on one hand, a political cartoon about a native king who the Judeans hated. In other words, it's a parable of Herod Antipas, representing the violence and greed of the elites who ruled Judea at the pleasure of the Roman Empire. You see that by this inner frame of the parable. On the other hand, the opening and closing frame of the parable makes two dark references to what is going to happen in Jerusalem. This suggests that the parable of the pounds is a thinly veiled warning tale told by Jesus on the arrest of his own, eve of his own arrest and trial, about the inevitable consequences of practicing Sabbath economics. That is to say, the violent demise of the parable's whistle-blowing third servant intentionally contrasts the happy conclusion of the story of Zacchaeus. It functions to caution the reader that even if someone powerful changes their life, that doesn't mean that the system changes. But it always means that discipleship has a cost. Luke's masterful pacing of the narrative, swinging dramatically from the hopeful vignette of Zacchaeus' repentance to the depressing parable about the fate of those who dare to defect from the system, sets the tone for the pendular swing of Luke's so-called triumphal entry, in which the ecstatic shouts of messianic praise by the crowd which accompanies the march is abruptly followed by Jesus' bitter lament over a doomed city. This remarkable dialectic between hope and political realism is, I believe, one of the most powerful characteristics of the third gospel. And we'll revisit that several times over the course of this webinar. Our overview of the narrative context of Jesus' march into Jerusalem concludes the three elements. I want to conclude by noting the three elements to Luke's triumphal entry narrative. We're going to mostly focus on the first, the march into Jerusalem, but all three dramatically develop the political narrative of Luke, in which it's Jesus' commitment to justice that culminates in his prophetic direct action on the central institution of exploitation among his people, namely the Jerusalem temple. Sound check. Are we having some problems? Okay. So let's turn now to the text that's going to occupy most of our attention. And we're picking it up, for those of you who do have your Bibles, at Luke 19, verse 28. Jesus is traveling from Jericho. That's where the story of Zacchaeus takes place. It's east of Jerusalem. And he's coming from the east into the village of Bethany, which was thought to have been about 1.5 miles east of Jerusalem. There, Jesus prepares to enter the holy city, but not as a reverent pilgrim demonstrating allegiance to the temple. Rather, he's coming as a subversive prophet, challenging the foundations of state power. Now, this Jerusalem narrative commences with this so-called triumphal entry, and as I've said, and want to keep emphasizing, it's a misnomer for a whole bunch of reasons. For one, Luke's story omits the hosannas and the palms, indicating that these elements actually aren't the most important parts of the parade, even though that's all that most first world Christians remember, because that's all we reenact in our own Palm Sunday celebrations. For another, this carefully choreographed political street theater is actually designed to repudiate messianic triumphalism. So let's take a careful look at this text. First of all, the setting of the parade is of central significance. Luke frames this section in Luke 19 by making it clear that Jesus' approach is defined first by Jesus' ascent of the Mount of Olives, verse 29. The village of Bethphage was thought to have been located somewhere on the southeastern slope of the mount, so Jesus is going up the mountain, and then a few verses later, he descends down on the Jerusalem side of the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives has always been an important feature to the Jerusalem landscape, still is today. From the 3rd millennium before the Common Era until the present, this 3,000-foot hill, or actually series of 3 mounts, has served as one of the main burial grounds for the city, from which it is separated by the Kidron Valley. I don't know if a few of you might have visited Jerusalem, but if so, you'll have a very vivid sense of what I'm talking about. Now, the fact that Luke's parade is firmly associated with the Mount of Olives, right? Jesus ascends and descends, all the while organizing this march, would have immediately brought to mind for the biblically literate reader the final apocalyptic battle between Israel and her enemies that is spoken of at some length in Zechariah chapter 14. This allusion, which would have been unmistakable to a first century Jewish reader, would have heightened the political tension of the parade to come, because it's invoking Judean hopes that their God would finally appear and liberate them from their enemies. But who were Judea's enemies in the first century? Well, it was the Roman occupying army. The rule of the Roman Empire at this time in history was absolute, not least in Palestine, which was a peripheral territory of the Pax Romana, but one that was tended to be restive, hence heavily armed legions were stationed there to keep things locked down, especially in Jerusalem. As some of you will recognize, I like to show this image to give a sense of Roman domination during this period. This is a 3rd century of the Common Era dedication plaque from a different periphery of the Pax Romana, in this case from northern England, Celtic country. The inscription is flanked by relief carvings. At left is Mars, the Roman god of war, brandishing a spear. At right, the mythological hero Hercules holding his club. At bottom is a running boar, symbol of the 20th Legion, which was the special troops who were dispatched to the peripheries of empire. So you find this dedication plaque to the 20th Legion both in northern England, and you also have the 20th Legion stationed in Palestine. This is the propaganda of empire. Its message is pretty clear. Don't mess with us. We will beat you down. Now, more than any of our other gospel writers, Luke makes a point to set his story in the concrete political space of empire. At the time Luke was writing, Rome was at the height of its power, embodied in the person of the one whom Luke names at the outset of his story simply as Emperor Augustus, the revered one. Imperator Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus ruled absolutely through patronage, military power, and political manipulation. Luke goes on at the beginning of his story in Luke 2, his birth narrative, to name a local imperial representative by the name of Quirinius, a Roman senator who was appointed to be governor of Syria from the years 6 to the years 12 of the Common Era, when Jesus was a little boy. Syria was one of the most important provinces of the empire, and it oversaw the colony of Palestine. Now, Quirinius' first job was to levy a universal tax, and of course to do that, first he needed to conduct a census. Now, this census was highly controversial. It was fiercely resisted by nationalist Judeans, because after all, the Roman coin with which the tax had to be paid would bear the image of either the goddess Roma or the divine emperor himself, a violation of at least 2 of the 10 commandments. So even if poor Judeans could pay the tax, which most of them couldn't, there was always the problem of idolatry. This is why, according to the ancient historian Josephus, The census named by Luke in chapter 2 provoked a rebellion by a certain Galilean named Judas, who incited his countrymen to revolt, scolding them as cowards for consenting to pay tribute to the Romans and tolerating mortal masters. Now, this revolt, which again happened sometime in the year 6 of the Common Era, was so notorious that it's also mentioned in volume 2 of Luke's literary masterpiece, Acts, in chapter 5. So here we have an example that right at the beginning of Luke's gospel, and for that matter of Acts, this story is set in a real political landscape. And this landscape really comes to the fore in the Palm Sunday story. Luke's narrative of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem is based on Mark's version. And the significance of this version is that well over half of it is devoted to the instructions given by Jesus to two disciples to procure him a mount. In between the ascent and descent of the Mount of Olives, we're given in uncharacteristic detail, as you see here, and repetition, the entire scenario. It's repeated twice. This gives the distinct literary impression that everything here is being deliberately choreographed. Jesus wants it done just this way. Get it right. This is the main reason I believe that we are justified in viewing the Palm Sunday March as carefully and strategically planned political street theater. Now, the symbol of this march, this donkey to whom we are paying attention, actually gives conflicting signals. Though the Mount of Olives invokes the messianic hope of divine war against the nations in Zechariah 14, the fact that Jesus is mounted upon a colt clearly invokes another oracle from Zechariah 9. Here, this famous one, your king comes humble and riding on a donkey. Now, bracketing, I want to look a little bit more closely at the Zechariah 9 text. Bracketing it is Zechariah's promise that Yahweh will end oppression of God's people forever, will make an encampment around the house against the armies of the oppressor. Now that's a real promise of political liberation. And on the other side of our famous Zechariah text, we find that this king, who is introduced as riding on a donkey, will announce an end to all political violence and war, and universal peace will be declared. So if you take it as a whole, all three verses, this oracle functions to undermine any possible military fantasies that ancient readers might have harbored by this idea of Messiah showing up on Mount of Olives. The donkey represents a symbol of peace. Jesus is a nonviolent Messiah. And Luke wants to make sure we understand that the disciples have gone to great lengths to procure this Zechariah donkey as the central prop in this piece of street theater. Yet the fact that this symbolism is nonviolent doesn't mean that it's not thoroughly political. Each detail in Luke's account invokes memories of Israelite sovereignty. For example, people laying their garments on the road would have recalled the popular declaration of Jehu as an upstart king in 2 Kings 9. This was kind of a popular insurgency in which the people proclaimed the king in a spontaneous demonstration. That's what is clearly being invoked by this part of the parade. For that matter, the donkey also signified the ancient triumph of the tribe of Judah that we read about way back in Genesis 49. So this donkey is not just a ride for Jesus. It represents the symbolic fulfillment of Israel's ancient dreams of sovereignty. It is, in other words, tantamount to a declaration of independence. And that's some pretty powerful political street theater. I know. Here's an analogy, and the 4 or 5 Canadians on the call will forgive me for using a archetypal American example. The Boston Tea Party. No, I mean the old school Tea Party. 1773. This was clearly a symbolic action, which nevertheless addressed both specific colonial policies, i.e. the tax on tea, that were felt to be economically odious, and yet at the same time unmistakably addressed the broader political issue of England's colonization of the American colonies. We don't always get this right when we learn about it in American elementary schools, but this public theater had costuming also. Did you know that many of the Sons of Liberty, as the group was called, dressed up as Mohawk warriors for the action? This was a very specific and symbolic costuming choice meant to show that they were identifying as Americans, not as subjects of Great Britain. Mohawk face paint. How ironic is that? What I'd like to do is just take a minute and invite you to see if you can think of other examples historically or in present time of symbolic political street theater, because I think that gets our juices flowing in the right direction to try to understand what's going on here in Luke. And I invite you to think of things either that you yourself have experimented with or that you know of, or things that have happened historically. That's a way of enriching the semantic field here of this party. And just go ahead and chat away as we continue with our reflection on this Palm Sunday parade. Now, if the donkey and cloaks on the road weren't enough to signal Jesus' parade as political theater, the chants that arise around him as he descends the Mount of Olives really seals the deal. They echo the royal processional and coronation hymn of Psalm 118. This would have functioned to further intensify the crisis over legitimate kingship in Israel in Jesus' time, because this is a coronation hymn. But this theater alluded not only to the hymn of the psalm, it wasn't just liturgical tradition, it was also alluding to much more recent events. It would have recalled the victorious military procession of Simon Maccabeus, the great guerrilla general who liberated Palestine from Hellenistic rule some 2 centuries before. According to 1 Maccabees 13:51, Simon entered Jerusalem with praise and palm branches and with hymns and songs. Well, that rings a bell. On top of that, even more recently, there had been an incident of messianic posturing at the beginning of the Judean revolt against Rome, just a couple of decades before Luke is writing. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, the guerrilla captain Menachem had marched through Jerusalem like a king in an unsuccessful attempt to become the sole leader of the rebel provisional government. So this was loaded theater, all kinds of political significance. And not only that, but this praising of peace in heaven, glory in the highest heaven, in verse 38, also challenges Roman sovereignty in the crowd's declaration. After all, this was exactly what the angels had proclaimed back in Luke's birth narrative, when the peasant shepherds at the birth of Jesus had their epiphany. This phrase, peace in heaven, glory in the heaven, was a clear usurpation of the discourse of Roman propaganda. It was customary for Roman poets and orators to declare peace and prosperity at the birth of the one to become emperor. But this is not in Luke the Pax Romana being proclaimed, It is a decidedly Israelite messianic vision of sovereignty. All of which is to say, Jesus is making political claims even as he repostures himself as a nonviolent Messiah. And this symbolism and its political significance would not have been lost on the local authorities and the imperial rulers of Palestine. Marcus Borg and Dom Crossan, in their 2006 book, The Last Week, a day-to-day account of Jesus' Passion Week, argue that there were likely not one but two processions into Jerusalem during the week of Passover. You see, the Passover feast days in Jerusalem was a very politically volatile time. The Jewish people, after all, were celebrating their divine deliverance from the Egyptian empire of the past, even as they were currently living under the Roman boot. The Roman authorities understandably feared that national Jews would seize on the high holy days to get stirred up again with all that talk about freedom and bondage. So, as Jesus was entering the city from the east, a cavalry led by the Roman governor Pilate would likely have been arriving in the city from the west. Pilate would have been bringing in his troops to the city as reinforcements during the high holy days to quell any overzealous nationalists who might be calling for freedom from the empire. I want to take a minute to consider more carefully this political theater of Roman triumphal procession as a foil to understanding Jesus' little demonstration across town. The imperial triumphus was both a civil ceremony and a religious rite that was held to publicly celebrate and sanctify the military achievement of Roman commanders who had won great military successes. So after the triumph, the general would typically hold a parade regalia that identified him as a near divine king. He would ride through the chariot in procession with his army and all the spoils of war. This imperial spectacle that would have been known throughout the Roman Empire, that the later of Colossians parodies in Colossians 2:15, in which risen Christ parades the principalities and powers who have been defeated by the cross, an intentionally ironic image. The Triumph of Caesar is a series of 9 large paintings created by the Italian Renaissance artist Andrea between 1886 and 1505 for the Ducal Palace in Mantua. They depict a triumphal military parade celebrating the victory of Julius Caesar in the Gallic Wars. These paintings remain the most complete pictorial representation of a Roman triumph ever attempted. But we don't need to rely on the Renaissance imagination. We can see Roman triumphalism depicted here in Trajanum, which was completed around the year 13 of the Common Era in Rome. It commemorated Trajan's victory in the Dacian Wars, and the standing column has a spiral bas-relief that artistically describes the triumph of the previous decade. And you can see on the top right the public procession of the defeated Dacians. That is what is the centerpiece of Triumphus. Here, similarly, the military triumph of General Titus, celebrating a victory march, is still visible today in the Arch of Titus in Rome. It was constructed in the year 82 of the Common Era, right around the time that Luke is writing, by the Emperor Domitian, shortly after the death of his older brother Titus, to create the latter's victories, including the victory over Judeans in the siege of Jerusalem a decade earlier. So the Erasmus Arch would have been roughly contemporaneous with the Gospel of Luke. And you see, this is a very famous image you've probably seen before. The Arch of Titus, there's a panel which specifically shows Roman soldiers marching back into the city of Rome with the spoils of war, in this case, which is plundered from the Jerusalem temple. So you see the giant menorah in the middle. So this humiliating your defeated enemy was sent to the triumphal procession of empire. Indeed, triumphal processions were an ancient tradition by the time of the Roman Empire, going back at least as far as the Assyrian Empire. There's certainly evidence of triumphal processions during the era of Greek sovereignty under Alexander the Great. And the triumphalist tradition endured long after Rome collapsed. Here you see from Akbar's triumphal entry into Surat in 1572, Alfonso's triumphal entry into Naples in 1443, and the triumphal entry of Augustin de Iturbide in the 19th century. In other words, all throughout the history of civilization, we see these sorts of images of empire. One of Peter Paul Rubens' most famous paintings was the triumphal entry of Henry IV into Paris in 1627. And yes, even Americans got into the act in Washington's triumphal entry into New York after the end of the Revolutionary War. Whether it exhibits the militaristic pomp of the triumphal entry into Paris by the German army in 1871, or the revolutionary fervor of the Zapatistas during the Mexican Revolution, the image is always the same. Warriors riding into a city, proclaiming victory and sovereignty. These images, I've shown all these images because it's important that for us to understand that this sort of idea of sovereignty, of domination, is deeply burned into our historical unconscious, both past and present, which is why the Palm Sunday parade of Jesus was so subversive and volatile. We should make no mistake, Roman soldiers marching into West Jerusalem during the High Holy Days was a show of force meant to intimidate any opposition to their occupation. And let us not forget that this still happens today in that very city to quell dissent with tragic consequences. In light of all of this, we can imagine that Jesus was staging a kind of counter-demonstration. As Pilate rode into the city on a war horse, Jesus comes on a borrowed donkey. The procurator proclaims a Pax Romana, the Nazarene a Pax Christi. Riding a lowly animal who symbolized the sovereignty of a prophetic nonviolent Messiah, of a God who would one day banish the war horse forever. There is no war horse in Jesus' procession, even though the war horse would have been central to any imperial triumphus. That war horse has been banished. That's pretty subversive stuff, then and still today. No wonder then that some of the local Judean authorities try to silence the crowds, wishing to avoid a controversial political scene. How often in the history of our churches have the authorities tried to suppress the hope among the poor when the crowds get riled up? Jesus' response to them is sharp and pointed. Now, his image of the stones crying out, as you might imagine, has prophetic background. It's citing Habakkuk chapter 2, which is a critique, not surprisingly, of the oppressive elite who build cities which then testify against them. In other words, Jesus here is taking sides of the masses, with the masses, refusing to control their popular resurgence of hope. I think it's worth noting that this conclusion to Luke's Triumphal Entry story is a unique Lucan addition to the Markan account, invoking yet again the prophetic critique of those who exploit the poor, which is an emphasis right throughout Luke's gospel from beginning to end. And Luke's addition also to Mark's account is the epilogue to the march, in which the mood abruptly changes. In verses 41 to 44, Jesus turns from messianic celebration to lamentation over the city that now comes into view. Jesus' lament here is a poignant realization that his own people are doomed to be crushed by the very empire that he is resisting, just as he himself will be crushed. So I want to look briefly at Luke's profound portrait of the Jesus who weeps over Jerusalem. As some of you may know from your own visitation of the Holy Land, I know that Steve Clemens and a few others of you have been. At the brow of the Mount of Olives is this magnificent view of across the Kidron Valley. It was said that when pilgrims came from the east to Jerusalem, saw the city for the first time, they'd cry joy. But instead, in Luke's story, Jesus cries out in pain and sorrow. Today, half up the Mount of Olives, there's a tiny shaped church. It's called Deus Flevit, the Lord wept. Now, 3 other times in Luke's gospel, Jesus laments or gives warnings about the fate of Jerusalem. The first one comes right after Jesus is warned Herod is out to get him. And you might remember he responds by calling Herod a fox, not a compliment. In 13:35. You might recall that this was the for the second Sunday in Lent in the Revival lectionary. Jesus offers a very maternal lament, wishing he could gather his people like a brood. Note the very intentional ironic riff between Herod the fox and Jesus gathering the hens for protection. Jesus then portends the moment we've just seen realized in the Palm Sunday procession, the promise of a blessing in the name of the Lord. So that's a first lament. The second lament is we've just seen on the Mount of Olives. And after the Palm Sunday lament comes the third lament, the little apocalypse in Luke 21, in which Jesus spells out in great, rather agonizing detail the siege that would surround Jerusalem and its destruction. On the only hints at this in the little apocalypse in Luke 21, you get chapter and verse. Of course, Jerusalem did in fact fall to the Romans after a short nationalist insurrection in the year Common Era. That Luke knew as a historian. Nazareth, with his keen political instincts, could 40 years earlier. This last instance, the fourth lament, is Jesus' response to the weeping women on the Via Crucis, which is traditionally commemorated in the 8th station of the cross. Those of you who watch Stations of the Cross next encounter. Here for the final time, Jesus instructs the residents of the city to recognize the disaster, alluding to how much worse oppression will be when the wood is. So 4 laments in Luke, really the center of which is Jesus weeping on the Mount of Olives. The Greek kleio in 1942 denotes bitter wailing. It's the kind of weeping and lamenting that is done in traditional societies, not the internalized depression that many of us in the West have for lament, but the very vocal, very externalized wailing. This was not Jesus going off to be by himself. He was making a ruckus on the Mount of Olives. I want you to feel the irony. The one who earlier in Luke's story bid women not to weep in the face of death in Luke 7 and again in Luke 8, here himself breaks down. Jesus in this moment seems to be the opposite of Isaiah's messenger, who was to proclaim peace, his feet standing on this same mountain. But Jesus instead speaks about the bitter truth of empire, which his people don't want to hear, because they have not known the things that make for peace. Now, says Jesus, these things are hidden from your eyes. The Greek word is crypto, whence our word cryptography, a biblical trope for people living in denial. And we might add, it's a hard word to us today, living as we do in the shadow of another empire, and equally clueless about the things that make for peace. I want you to feel the pathos of Jesus' words, especially in the narrative here, verses 43 and 44. The vocabulary is truly depressing, if realistic. Ramparts, which connote a military installation involving the use of palisades and entrenchments, siege works that hem in a city and its citizens. And when the verbs turn downright brutal, people will be dashed to the ground, no stone on another, all because people did not record their reputation. This is the realistic vocabulary of imperial war. Gone hope of Zechariah's song back in Luke chapter 1 that we would be saved of all who hate us. No, instead, Jesus echoes the prophet Elijah's lament over the specter of an inevitable war on women and children by the king of Aram on his people. On this poignant tradition of the weeping prophet. And not only Elijah, but we think of Jeremiah lamenting the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon in Jeremiah 6. True biblical prophecy is not about foretelling the future in a crystal ball, but understanding the consequences of bad national behavior and speaking those living in denial. In these kinds of forebodings, Luke's Jesus is also drawing on traditions such as Ezekiel 4 or Hosea 10 that similarly foretold disaster coming upon the holy city, reminding us the inconvenient truth that no beloved people and no revered place will be spared the consequences of bad collective behavior. These dark visions obviously pass the siege of Jerusalem in the year 7. About that, since we are commemorating another war, Historian Josephus, who was an eyewitness to the siege and fall of Jerusalem, described it thus: Titus' soldiers leave to set the suburbs on fire, and ordered that they should number together and raise banks against the city. And he placed those shooting darts and archers in the midst of the banks that were being raised, and placed those engines, the works of siege, and those throwing javelins and stones, that he might prevent the enemy from sallying out and hinder those that were upon the wall. The trees were cut down immediately, by the way, in direct defiance. And the suburbs, now the timber was prepared to raise the banks, and the whole army earnestly engaged their work. We might as well be reading from the Gospel of Luke, and yet his 40 years is reported uttering these words. And then Josephus concludes, so all hopes of escaping was cut off from the Jews. Their liberty of going out of the city no longer. Then did its progress, devouring by whole houses, upper full of women and children dying, the lanes of the city full of dead bodies of the elderly. And then the temple was set fire, everything was plundered. 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Was there a commiseration, any age, any reverence for children or the old, priests slain in the same manner? So the war went round all sorts and brought them to destruction. And after this, the Romans fired to the city and burnt them down, entirely demolishing its walls. We know that the Romans killed more than 1 million who had taken refuge in the city, and took captive another 100,000 as they completed of the city. This was nothing short of a national disaster, and Jesus saw it coming. Friends, Luke's gospel is a lament which culminates in Jesus weeping over the city. Stark and a to Jesus in no way triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And I think that's an important corrective for the way that Palm Sunday has become jubilant and often trivialized. But maybe not this year, not so close on the heels of the 10th anniversary of the Gulf War. So I want us to take another minute now and think of all the victims of war, especially those in Iraq and the combatants, the civilians over the last decade, but also all of those in Israel, Palestine today, that place where our Gospels were set, which still suffers from not knowing the things that make for peace. And let's just take another minute and chat things that we want to lament. And once again, I want to play a little bit of our music as I invite you to chat the things for which you want to lament. One of the laments that we have learned from our friends at the Jeannie Wiley community in Detroit, where Elaine is as we speak, is this one on the screen. And to complete our sermon, I want to teach it to you, and I'm going to sing it through a few times, and perhaps you want to quietly sing it to yourself wherever you are. It, I think, accurately captures the dialectic of joy and pain that is narrated in our text tonight. And it goes like this. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Part of me wants to sing about the light. Part of me wants to cry, cry, cry. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Part of me wants to sing about the light, and part of me wants to cry, cry, cry. Down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Part of me wants to sing about the light. Part of me wants to cry, cry, cry. Deep down inside of me. The third and final part of Luke's Jerusalem entry is the cleansing. With almost no segue from the heart-wrenching moment of weeping on the mountain, Luke reports simply, and then Jesus in the temple. It is as if he's drawing a direct connection between the destruction of the city with the place where the oppression of the poor had become institutionalized. The place where the nation's wealth was concentrated into the hands of the elite. Luke's version of this notorious episode is the shortest of any four Gospels. It's a scant 2 verses. But Luke's account, as spare as it is, while we're waiting, I'll just share that one of the things that happens at the Palm Sunday Peace Parade is that it begins in a church in northwest Pasadena in the lower income part of town, and we process a couple of miles down into the Ritz shopping district of Pasadena, and there we hold the rally right out in front of one of the biggest shopping malls, trying to draw attention to some of the contradictions right in Pasadena. This year is going to be special for the there's both a concert beforehand, but also a gun buyback program that's happening in concert with the Peace Parade. So it's been nice to see this tradition develop over the last 10 years. Anything happening out there in public liturgy land? For those of you who don't know Bill's book, Seasons of Faith and Conscience, Charlita has given you a URL to link to it to purchase if you're interested. It's a classic and has been a book that has really helped a lot of us for years and years. That book's now, I think, 20 years old at least. Yeah, Charlita is alluding to the fact that every couple of years the Mennonites gather in convention, and this year it's going to be in Phoenix, which is a bit of a train wreck given Arizona's laws around immigration. And so some, particularly Mennonite, young Mennonite, really trying to discern whether to use the temple cleansing as a kind of a trope for the turning over of some tables, either inside the convention, some kind of demonstration of symbolic happens. Charlita's been trial some of the bureaucrats on this, and I think it's been kind of an uphill battle. Susie's reporting that folks in Toronto tend to focus on Good Friday public liturgy, and that is certainly true around North America, and that's a great thing to do. Contemporary Stations of the Cross and so on. Solveig reporting in from Portland. Hello, dear sister. She's talking Sunday as the closing of their Lenten discipline this year, which her Wilderness Way community has been sharing with people all around the country, being outside for at least 10 minutes a day, just being. And I know that's inspired some interesting blogging, and so they're going to have collective celebration. That's lovely. I'm sure that's a really powerful time. We wish you could. Susie's for their Good Friday walk. So that's great, Susie. You get about 300 people to that. That's impressive. It'll be interesting to see if there are connections with the Idle No More campaign as you continue to develop that tradition. Hope the weather is enough for you in that. And Solveig is reporting that their Good Friday ritual here will be a lament over the Willamette River. So really working us into this, I think, is one of the cutting edges of this kind of public liturgy. Carl at our institute last month, reporting in from Berkeley. Carl's a veteran of this kind of thing, and he's going to be gathering with folks at Livermore Labs, which is one of the two national labs where nuclear weapons are researched and developed. And there has been a tradition of Holy Weekends at Livermore Lab that goes all the way back to the time that I was in Berkeley in the 80s. So that's great, Carl. Will continue to be, and then I know members of your church will be participating in that. Anybody else? Steve, I don't know if you're still on there, but you've always got something up your sleeve there in Minneapolis. Would love to hear from you. I know it's hard when everybody's typing at once, when we have these short times for feedback. We got to figure out a better way to do this so the track isn't trying to jam through such a narrow arc. We think that kinds of ways of being church some of the most important witnesses out there, and particularly as we have a new generation, particularly young evangelicals, post-evangelicals, who are discovering social justice really for the first time. It is my hope that they can also be invited to come along to some of these traditions we've been developed over the last few decades, because they're very, very powerful times. Obviously, the Posada Sin Fronteras that we do at the border in December is that kind of public liturgy. This year we'll be having the 20th anniversary of the Posada Sin Fronteras, and we're hoping that Susie and her family will come out and join us in December for the 20th anniversary, and some of you might want to join us as well. I want to invite anybody else to keep sharing, and we'll just let these sharings continue through the last 5 minutes of the webinar. We like to end on time, more or less. I want to thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. We hope there's been at least a little bit of space in this webinar, not only to pay careful attention to the Lucan text in its context, but also to have a little space to examine our own hearts and spirits in this time of continuing lament. On April 19th, 1995, a U.S. government office complex in downtown Oklahoma City was bombed, claiming 168 lives and leaving over 800 injured. It was at the time the deadliest act of terrorism on U.S. soil. The perpetrator was a young, economically struggling advocate of white supremacy and a veteran of the First Gulf War. This terrible moment offered Americans a mirror into which we were invited to look in order to see the violence at the heart of our national story. Today, standing in front of the poignant Memorial Park in Oklahoma City is a statue of Jesus weeping, alluding to the verse in Luke's Gospel that we have just studied. It is my prayer that we will all continue to try to learn the things that make for peace. Charlita and Tim and I want to thank you for spending the evening with us. Our next webinar is going to continue in this vein of Bible study, trying to reclaim beloved but relentlessly sentimentalized texts. Next month we'll be well into the season of Easter, and we'll tackle Luke's Emmaus Road story. Luke 24. It's a beautiful but troubling tale, which has been thoroughly chocolate-coated in churchly Easter traditions. So we'll attend to the remarkable politics and theology of this Luke's unique account of the very first Bible study in the history of our Jesus movement. After that, in May and June and possibly July, we'll be taking a break from Bible study and move into the other tradition that we like to emphasize, namely biography as theology. In May, we'll be looking at the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham Children's Campaign of the Civil Rights Movement. And in June, we'll be interviewing Liz McAllister of Jonah House to talk about the 40th anniversary of Jonah House Resistance Community in Baltimore. And in July, I'm hoping to interview the founders of the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice. So a lot of really great movement history and tradition coming up after April. We hope you'll think about joining us in April with your Bibles in hand. And again, thanks for being with us. We want to send you out tonight with gratitude and invite you to keep texting, keep chatting with your ideas, and we'll send you out with a little bit more lively Palm Sunday music from the Celtic musician Rick Blair, and a very relevant word from the Berkeley Anglican commentator David Henson. So thanks everybody for joining us.